Welcome back to the PolicyViz podcast. I'm your host, John Schwabish. I hope you are well. I hope the weather is turning nice into spring. But you are listening to a podcast. You're probably out walking in the sun, walking your dog, taking a run, taking a jog. I don't know, but I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you have tuned in to this week's episode of the show, where we're going to learn more about data in Tableau. I'm really excited to have on the show Kirk Munroe. Join me for the conversation. Kirk is the author of the new book, Data Modeling with Tableau. Kirk is also one of the chiefs at Paint with Data. And here's the thing. I was on Twitter sort of complaining about, and I'm going to admit, I was complaining about how a lot of Tableau blog posts ignore the part about the format of your data, the structure of your data. And a lot of that is because most of those tutorials use the basic built-in data sets within Tableau. Fine, that's great. But in many cases, my data aren't as clean, or they're not in the same format, the same structure. So Kirk reached out. He's got this great blog post on the Kevin and Ken Flurledge twins blog on their website, which I will also share in the show notes. But he's also got this new great book, Data Modeling with Tableau, where I am almost certainly going to offer the first two chapters at least, if not the full book, but at least the first two chapters to my students, ways to think about how to use data in Tableau. I just think this is super important. You can't get to the visualization part without knowing anything about the data part, and particularly about the data structure part. So I hope you'll enjoy this week's episode of the podcast. Here's my conversation with Kirk. Hey, Kirk. Good morning for both of us, even though we're like an hour apart, right?
An hour apart. Yeah, good morning, John. Thanks for having me on.
I was saying, because
I
was saying earlier, now that I understand that Halifax time is an hour ahead, when it's 4:00 Eastern, I can say, well, it's cocktail hour in Halifax, so time to pour.
Well, 5 o'clock somewhere at 4.
Right. Right. But now I know exactly where it's 5 o'clock at 4, so I feel
yes,
bad.
Exactly.
Well, thanks for coming on the show. I'm excited to chat with you because let me give listeners just a quick background. So I was having I was wrestling a little bit with data formats in Tableau. And the one thing I had noticed in a lot of blog posts of Tableau tutorials was that people didn't talk about the structure of the data. They're always using the Superstore data, and it's in this particular format. And you had responded with this fantastic blog post that you had written for Kevin and Ken Flurledge, and that was really great. And then on top of that, you have this great new book, Data Modeling with Tableau, which the first 2 or 3 chapters go into even more detail on that. So I reached out, super happy to have you on the show. But I want to start with a little bit of background. You have a firm, Paint with Data, but you also have a impressive background before that. So I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about that, and then we can dive into some Tableau stuff.
Yeah, sure. And thanks. Happy to be here. My background in BI, at least, without going to the whole history, started in 2001. I went to Cognos as a product manager, and I kind of went up the product management ranks there for about 5 years. The reason I liked being a product manager at that time was BI analytics was still a little bit nascent. So I felt like being on the product side, I have a bit of a technical background, was the place to be. Then still working there, I went more into once we got bought by IBM, I went into sales enablement because I thought the natural next step of that was to help sellers, customer-facing people actually understand what analytics was. Right. Like, it's not just reports that you get bursted to people that have static information, right? Like, what actual analytics meant in answering business questions. And then I went to a supply chain analytics company called Kinaxis and ran product and marketing there. We did super deep analytics, but very niche. So we could do cool things like if you had a bill of materials for, say, I don't know, 2 different laptop models, and you could ask a question of it and say, well, what if we took this part from this one and gave it to this one? And you could see how many customer orders would be late within seconds.
Oh, wow.
Which would normally take overnight to run in a MRP system or something, right? And then, anyway, I did a startup again. Then I went to Tableau, actually, for 4 years to do customer success because I was drawn to that because I thought, the stage we'd gotten to is that people didn't understand. They understood analytics at a high level, but they didn't know how to make it
Yeah.
happen. I did that for 4 years, and then on the paint with data thing, my wife actually, who's a Tableau
Mhm.
ambassador or user group ambassador, started a company called Paint with Data to be a consultancy, and of course we used take data and actually paint
Right.
with it. And so we're a consultancy that work with companies of all kinds of different sizes. I joined 18 months
Mhm.
ago. It was the intersection of two things, really. One was we had always said we wanted to work together, and then we kind of went, "Oh, geez, we're running out of time if
Right.
we're going
Right.
to do
Yeah.
this."
Yeah.
And and part of it was just the customer success role was good at Tableau. It started to get a little bit frustrating that I couldn't get hands on, like the things that really make customers
Hmm.
successful. Like the job became a little bit too much
Yeah.
relationship as opposed to
Like
the
in the
things that
tool.
actually make
Right.
people like is their data
Yeah.
structure,
Right.
right? As an
Right.
example,
Right.
right? So, and the role got really far removed from that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. Like they didn't care that new hires were trained in Tableau, really, or certainly at that kind of
Yeah.
level, right? Like it was, I would go get every Tableau certification you could get. You know, I mean, I thought it was really
Yeah.
important to, if you're going to be a trusted advisor, you
Know the
got to know
tool.
more than the people you're
Right.
advising
Right.
conceptually,
Right.
right? To me,
Yeah.
so yeah.
So okay. So you joined 18 months ago. So were you working on the book at the same like was that?
Uh, Now, so the book was kind of a funny thing because I joined and then I was in for maybe 6 months. And then the publisher called
Mhm.
me and went, "Do you want to write a book? We want someone to write a book on data modeling when you write
Yeah.
this book in Tableau." And the first thing I thought was, well, who am I to write a book? And of course, you get into there's so many smarter people than me that could do this, which is just a natural thing to
Yeah.
do, I think. And I thought, and I think in my head, I went, there's so many Viz books in the road all the time. There must be a lot of data modeling books. So I asked for 24
Hmm.
hours and I did a search and there are none.
No.
So to be fair, Carl Alchin is
Hmm.
awesome. Like, Carl's got a book on Tableau prep, but like not on data modeling, the kind of the stack for Tableau. So I went, well, then this has happened to me a lot in my life. I go from why me to why not
Right.
me.
Right.
and then started writing the book in about April, I
Okay.
guess. And so it took about 6 months from April to
Okay.
October to write the book. And then I thought it would be, a 200-page
Hmm.
book. And trying to be as concise as I could possibly be, I got it down to it turned out to be 325
Yeah.
pages in
I've
the
been
end. Like there's kind of more there than I
there.
thought
Right.
there would be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been there. So, okay, so let's talk about data. Um, I preface this whole conversation with this difference kind of between wide data and tall data, but maybe I'll ask the question in sort of a more general way. Like, from your perspective, what is the biggest challenge, in particular, I guess, new Tableau users face when it comes to the data modeling and the data structure in Tableau?
Um, yeah, to do one step back
Yeah.
from that, which I get to it in a little bit in the book, and I think we'll probably have more blog posts on this, is what makes Tableau so special that no one sees actually is VizQL, which Tableau used to talk
Hmm.
about. So until Tableau came along, you would have to query your data, and then you'd have to format your data a little bit, and then you would visualize
Yeah.
your data. So, and most other BI tools, I think ThoughtSpot are doing a pretty good job at the same kind of approach as Tableau now. But traditionally, what it is you open up a product, and the first thing it'll ask you is, how do you want to chart this data? And my frustration until I saw Tableau, and I was working at Cognos, so we were one of the frustrations at the
Yeah.
time. Well, it's like I don't know how I want to visualize it yet. I'm just trying to interact with
Yeah.
my
Right.
data, right? So Tableau solved that problem, and what it is so basically when they write their SQL underneath the scenes, they have this clause appended on the end that basically goes display as, which is why people fight Tableau sometimes and find it unintuitive at the very
Hmm.
start. But if you get in, Tableau used to talk about at least the analytics flow, you just start clicking around and ask and answer
Yeah.
questions and dragging things to marks cards, and the viz keeps
Right.
changing without you explicitly going, drop this on columns or I want color on it. It's smart enough to mostly
Right.
know. Like I rarely drag anything to a column or row shelf as an
Yeah.
example. I'm a big double
Okay.
clicker.
Yeah.
right? And I let Tableau figure
Yeah.
that
Yeah. Yeah.
out, right? Then I might swap rows and columns, but I
You
rarely
rally drag me.
drag
Okay.
to that background's important, I think, because Tableau always assumes, and this is where the data modeling comes in, is that your data structure underneath has a series of columns that it's going to convert to
Mm-hmm.
fields, and every one of those columns is going to be distinct. So not discrete, which we get to, but distinct in that if it says customer, the only thing in that field is going to be
Yeah.
customer, and if it says revenue, the only thing that's going to be in there is revenue, sales,
Right.
etc. And and that's why a lot of people pick up Superstore. It's already formatted that way, and they have a lot of fun, and they bring in their own data. And they choke and they
Right.
don't know what's going on. And the reason Tableau does that is it makes this VizQL thing
Mm-hmm.
easy to do. It makes it easy to know how to visualize it because they know how the data is
Right.
structured, right? I guess they assume how the data is structured.
Right.
So that's
Yeah.
why, right? So that's why you can run into
Yeah.
problems. And I say without without needing to be super technical, the way CPUs work, like I've always worked, is they work well when you pass them an array of data, and then you can filter, slice, whatever that, and they're really good at aggregating it. So analysis at the end of the day is about some level of aggregation of data. Visual analytics, which Tableau does, is that visually. So basically, it's really easy if you have a row called revenue, and then you pull on region, it's easy for Tableau to go, okay, sum, and then break it down by that
Mm-hmm.
region, right? And then color it by subcategory. That'd be ugly, but it would know color it by subcategory. It does this stuff very fast if the data is structured that
Right.
way. If, for instance, your field was conditional and it said, it was called name, and the next column was vendor or customer, and then there was a name, and the next column had vendor, customer, and you had to try to dynamically write a calculation in Tableau to go, if this column equals
Right.
vendor, then this one, Tableau's going to be
Yeah.
terrible. Like it's just
Yeah.
awful, right? Because it assumes that structure, right? Which I knew as soon as I went to Tableau, we had to do a demo at a
Yeah.
time to get hired, and I refuse to use Superstore because no data looks like this. Like I've been around long enough that I knew that, so I brought in a bunch of Airbnb data or inside Airbnb data, just great
Yeah.
data, but to show, and then I made a whole scenario about. If you were working for the city, how happy would you be with this? Or you were a potential host. And I did a whole demo around that. And then I realized, this like formatting data thing is tricky. Like you got to get this right. So yeah, that's it. So that's, I guess, fundamentally it's 325 pages of how do you get your data like that. And because, there's a lot of nuance beneath that.
So, and I know you're not at Tableau anymore, so this is, just dreaming, but like if you had your druthers, would you have Tableau focus there? Presumably they have an AI and an ML team working on a variety of things. Would you have them do something similar to the Show Me tab, but not for graphs, but for data, where it says it looks like your data in this structure? Would you want it in this structure? And you click a couple buttons and you're good to go.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and then it may be on the what's the new feature called, the workbook optimizer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
should be more than just. I mean, it should be able to go. Then it's getting there a little bit, but it definitely has to, I think, get better at going. The reason that you have all these calculations and weird parameters and whatever is because your data is not shaped right. I think, and I think it would be not terribly hard for them to pick it up. I know. Like Ken Flairlich has a great line, which I love, which is, if you're doing something in Tableau and it seems like it's more difficult than it should be, it's probably because your data shaped wrong. Like it's just, you can just like, this is more complicated than it should be. Like 9 times out of 10, that's because your data is not shaped right.
So what, so for those who are, let's say like me, sort of relatively Tableau newbies, what do you recommend for folks to do when they're in that position where they're struggling and maybe they even realize, oh, my data's wide and it needs to be long or tall? Like what tools do you use to do that reshaping when you're working in it?
Yeah, well, I mean, first they should buy the book.
Well, obviously, yeah.
But no, but other than the book, I think it's just that the first exercise is whether you use a piece of paper or you mentally do it or whatever. Just like if you were going to I know Chantilly talks about this a lot, is not the only one, who talks about if you're going to create a visualization, you should kind of map it on a piece of paper or somewhere first to see. You should think about what would it take before I even get to a tool. What would it take to get these fields into these very distinct columns, right? And then the thought would be sometime, and most of the time, what it's going to take is, if it's not, is pivoting rows to columns or pivoting columns to rows, and it's that simple usually. And then you can pivot columns to rows in either desktop or prep, and you can pivot rows to columns in prep. I feel like that's a feature that's been in there now for at least a couple of years that almost no one's seen. Other than the prep community knows is there. It's the slickest little feature. And it just makes the world a difference, because when you open up a workbook and you see if people have those type calculations I was talking about, like if this field equals profit, then profit, and then they've got a string field to put dollar signs in front of it. I'm like, just reshape that. Do you know what I mean? Just reshape that.
String, and a dollar sign. I've done all that too.
And in prep, it's literally pivot rows to columns, and it's like, which one do you want to put? And then you drag two things over, and it's done. Do you know what I mean? Like prep is a terribly underrated tool,
so let's talk about prep, because you have I think it's like part 2 of the book. I think there's like 4 or 5 chapters that are dedicated to using prep. So is that section in there because you feel it is the right tool for Tableau users, or because there really isn't, like in my reading, there's just not enough, I would say enough materials out there to really help you dive into it?
Yeah, sometimes I wonder a lot if prep, like a lot of features come out. So it's probably a few things. Like Alteryx had this great partnership with Tableau. So a lot of people probably knew that, right? And if you're already licensed for that, then you could substitute everything in prep. That's fine. Do you know what I mean? But I think for people that don't have it, especially, I think a couple of things happened. First off, when prep came out, it didn't do a lot. It was okay, but it didn't do a lot. It was still kind of a cool product back in 2018 now. And I think a lot of people might have evaluated it then and ridden it off a little bit and not kept up with all the innovation that's in it. But certainly it's a really valuable tool for people who already know Tableau well. Because first off, it comes with a creator license. I mean, there's the annoying thing to schedule that you need data management, but it comes with it. It's the same calculation language. It's the same UI in as far as you could have the same UI and UX. Like they're different UXs because they're different processes. So, I mean, from a cost of ownership, it's just so low to use prep. Like I wish more people use. I'll tell you, we talked about this before we started a little bit. Like, so I've been in data for 22 years, and I probably haven't, other than a very simple line of SQL, probably haven't written a line in 18 or something. And even though people insist on asking for these SQL skills, I'll give you an idea of how much I avoid it. Lately, I've been using Snowflake. So technically I'm writing a SQL statement to create my Snowflake table, but it's not really a SQL statement. So I create my table, and then what I do is, relationships are also a very powerful thing in Tableau, but they only work against live connections. So you can't use prep per se. But prep I know so well now, and it's so familiar that I usually create my Snowflake tables and I prep the data and load it into Snowflake with prep. Like I don't even always use a published data source. Like I'll go into prep and then do what I need to do to it, and I'll move it to a Snowflake table. Because let's say I've got 2 tables at different levels of aggregation, and I don't want to explode those. I'll put them into 2 Snowflake tables, and then I'll get Tableau to create a relationship. So I don't even always use a published data source. So sometimes I'm using something like Snowflake to actually as the output. So you don't even have to think about it's always. But the last thing on it is I don't know why Tableau has been so hesitant to call it an ETL tool, because it's what it's always been. Like you extract data, you transform it, and you load it somewhere else. I think they were afraid to do it because they're like, well, we don't want to compete against all these like ETL specific. Like you don't have to say that's what you are. Do you know what I mean? Like if I was going to some data engineering team that never did visual analytics, I would not recommend Tableau Prep just because there's probably more powerful tools. But for someone who's used to Tableau anyway. Like, why
Yeah.
not? Like, the cost of ownership
It is
is
an
so much lower.
interesting thought about who they target. Like, what is their avatar of their core customer base? And I always find that interesting because the folks that I work with tend to be, it's a nonprofit of 6, 8, 12 people, and there's like one person or two people who have demonstrated this interest in creating visualizations, but they're
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily maybe data people. They don't have coding experience. Maybe they never used a tool like this before, and I think they often get, as you've mentioned, they get frustrated by these little but crucial
Right.
things. And maybe being able to help those folks would unleash it. I don't really know, but
Yeah, you know what? That's a great point. For if I were, for consulting with a small company, say, I would say it's worth learning data at the level of Tableau
mm-hmm.
prep
Yeah,
first, especially for the non-traditional technical people who don't come from a programming
yeah,
background, because not only is your viz going to be easier and faster, they're actually not going to have to write nearly as many
yes,
calculations and struggle with that kind of
right,
stuff in
right.
Tableau, right? Because otherwise they're going to get frustrated because they're like, I'm not a coder and I have to write all
Too much
this.
stuff.
And I'm like, you wouldn't if the data were
Right.
structured the right way. And this idea of like every column being distinct is not that hard of a
No.
concept to get. I don't know why people don't go back to
Yeah.
make it that way. It's just I just neatly need it
Yeah.
in a column. It just you need pretty good SQL skills before this pivot rows to column. I think that's the secret
Mm-hmm.
feature of Tableau
Yeah.
because it's so fast and it's a little bit hard to do in SQL. Like it would be daunting to
Right.
try to split that up, and it's counterintuitive because it makes your data longer and people think, oh, long data is
Right.
slow. I'm like, long data is
No.
not slow
Right.
at
Right.
all,
Right.
right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is interesting. I mean, there is, I grew up in the SaaS data world, and there is like I burned into my brain. There's a little image in the Stata help file about the reshape command, which goes from they use long and wide is what the language they use. But there's this
Yeah.
image. It's like here's a wide, and then it's like a little arrow, and then here's the long, and if you want to go left to right, this is the syntax. You want to right to left,
Yep.
this is the syntax, and I agree. It's not a complicated concept to get, but it's so crucial to everything that you're going to do
Right.
down the road. Okay, so almost without intentionally doing it, we've talked about the first two parts of the book. So I think it makes sense we should get to. So we get to the last part. So the first part is really about the types of data models, setting up your data. The second part is about prep, and then the third part is about connecting and building relationships, which
Right.
I have found also to be a frustrating, especially the relationship part. So frustrating piece. So I don't. So I guess I guess I'll just make it a super general question, which is, as we walk through now through the book and sort of the process by which someone would work in Tableau, what is this third part about when it comes to connecting and building relationships in the data?
Yeah. So the next thing becomes almost, I wish there was a term for this, like it's treating tables instead of tables as distinct analytic units that sometimes need to be combined to perform a different level of analysis. So I also, like you referenced the blog
Mm-hmm.
post that I had on Ken and Kevin's site on the FloridasTwins.com. I have two more coming, one on when to use prep and when to use
Oh, okay.
desktop. And then another one on when to use relationships versus
Mm-hmm.
joins, and just a little bit on blends, because the blends answer is almost never.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just one
Right.
use case, just one very specific use case. So and so let me imagine this. This will probably be in the blog post, but imagine this Airbnb data. I think we
Mm-hmm.
can do it, right? So you've got. Let's say we have 5 tables,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the 5 tables are, one table contains our list of all the properties, say in a city or whatever. It could be all
Sure.
of them, but with a city
Yeah.
column to split it up. But like, let's say even for a city, and then we've got
Mm-hmm.
reviews, right? And so reviews are at a different level of granularity than the properties because one property can have many
Yeah.
reviews, but a review can only be for one
Right.
property, right? So you don't until relationships came out. That's a perfect example of tables you don't want to
Mm-hmm.
join, And the reason you don't want to join them is you're going to explode it, and then you're going to have to watch your level of aggregation because you're going to have many rows
Yeah.
now for individual properties because it had many
Right.
reviews, right? So what's just magical about relationships is you create a relationship on those on the property ID, the listing ID, and now what happens, and I mean by individual units of analysis, is I can ask questions about reviews without asking about properties, and I can ask about properties without asking reviews. So if I ask a question on either side of that, Tableau is only going to generate the SQL behind the scenes against that one table, like no join.
Right.
It won't even look to join it. But then what's really smart about relationships is if, let's say I want reviews on a given property, Tableau's smart enough to do that it would probably be a right join the way I'm describing it doesn't matter, but it would create that join dynamically to answer your question and handle the level of aggregation so you don't get it. Because I think, especially for non-technical users, like understanding levels of aggregation is like really hard to wrap your head around, and then Tableau takes your mind away from that. So imagine those two tables. Next thing you want to do is I want to bring in neighborhood information, right? So I want to bring in a shape file of neighborhood so I can map it. And then I want to bring in the walk score and bike score or whatever. I can go get that off the internet. And maybe I want to go get apartment information on how expensive apartments are by neighborhood. So I could answer the question, does it look like Airbnb are driving up the price of apartments? Or it's a tricky question, right? The best part of analysis. Or am I helping people afford it because they can use Airbnb to help them offset? So, but those could be three separate tables, right? Yeah. One with the shapefile, one with the walk scores, and one with the cost of. So the temptation would be, and you could do this, but it would be a little bit complicated. You could bring all those in as relationships because that would be the default. But if you think about it, those three tables are all about neighborhood information. And they're all at the same level of granularity, which is one row per neighborhood. So what I would do is, and this is why relationships and joins go together really well, I would join those three tables together, and then I would create a relationship on those three tables joined together, because Tableau would then effectively treat those three join tables as one table, because it really should be one, without me having to do a whole data engineering job to put those in one in the background. So and then I can ask questions just about neighborhoods, or again, I can ask neighborhood, how many reviews per neighborhood, how many listings per neighborhood, or whatever. But it's just an example of, if you think about it in terms of, is it a unit of analysis on its own, one's neighborhoods, one's reviews, one's listing, as opposed to tables, and what their level of granularity is, that also takes the complications out of that a little bit.
It's also interesting from the perspective back to this, single person in some small organization, back to they need to pull all these data together. Maybe not even for a visualization purpose. They just need to have these data together for whatever it is. And they could use Tableau to do that because it's so efficient at doing these different things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. So that, and I still think even a big org, so in little orgs, you have no data engineering support. Right. My experience, at least, maybe people have seen other things. The one place where I still see waterfall process heavy, slow things are data engineering teams. Like cloud data warehouses didn't magically solve that problem. Right. So sometimes you'd be like, I need my data shaped this way. And they'll be like, well, it's got to go through this. You need to get this approval. It's going to cost this much in a chargeback, and we'll have it to you in 3 months. It's like, well, you know what? I'll just take the data you've already given me without going all the way back to source. And later in the data pipeline, I'll clean it up. Right. So I talk a lot about, in a completely idealistic world, you wouldn't want an analyst doing this stuff. But you have to. Like, you're never going to get answers out to the organization if you wait for the data engineering org to do it or whatever. That would throw us back into the... You know what I mean? Like,
the last part of the book, which admittedly I haven't read because it isn't as useful for my use case. So everybody's got limitations. But the last part is on Tableau Server and Tableau Online. So what are the differences in that section versus, say, working in desktop?
Yeah, so the last sections cover and I wish there was a word for Tableau server and line together because they're
Yeah.
synonymous in this. So I keep going Tableau server or
Yeah.
cloud, and it's like the exact
Right.
same for all intents and purposes. There's basically there's that you could think of in three different ways. The book's not exactly organized this way. One is all about data security, and data security at two levels. So one is who can see the data. So who can see the data model, right? And the next level is who can see data within that data model. Because so imagine the first one, you just want only the finance team to see it. How do you make sure that only the finance team can see it? The next example of who can see it is like imagine you were giving this out to your customers, and you had thousands of them. You wouldn't want to build thousands of workbooks. You would want to say only the customer logging can only see their own data and produce one workbook. So that row level security. So part of it's about that. So part of it's about how do you secure these data models and how do you secure the data within them. Part of it's on distribution. So when to use published data sources versus embedded data sources. Another thing, lots of people have been using Tableau, including Tableau server or online cloud for like a long time, and don't know the difference between an online versus an embedded data source and when to use one versus the other. And it's important to get that right from a kind of cost of ownership thing, because you could be rebuilding the same data model over and over again on one side. Or the flip side is you could be publishing a data model that was really only intended for one workbook, and people are trying to build workbooks on it, and you don't want them to because it was very specific for the workbook. So they both have their place. And Tableau doesn't make it very explicit, although at least now on Tableau Cloud, Tableau Server, you can say, new published data source. So they at least have taken it at a desktop enough that it feels like a distinct thing. And then the last part is around all the other things that come with Tableau data management. So how to schedule prep flows, how to have data quality warnings, the Tableau data catalog at lineage to see who else is using this. So there's only one of 15 chapters on data management, but one of them covers all the things that come with data.
So before we wrap up, I want to come back to one of the things we were talking about before we actually started recording, which is data size, the size of data. Because you mentioned a couple of times when we were talking, but you had mentioned a very interesting piece of extracting data in Tableau that I don't think I even really recognize, because when I do the extract, I just do extract and good and publish, and I'm good to go. Right. So I wanted to finish up with that data extract tip, because I think this is something that probably most people don't know about the sort of way that you can modify or option in that extract menu.
Yeah. And the background for this, I think I heard recently, I hope this is a true stat, but that the average Salesforce deployment, as example, has 100 custom fields in it. I'm sure some people go, we 1,000, I don't know. But what happens is, anyway, that's the kind of thing that leads to really wide data. Even if all the fields are discrete, sometimes the data still gets incredibly wide with all these ways you could slice and dice the data. So, and that wide data definitely makes Tableau slow, especially if there's string fields, because they're usually string descriptive type fields. And so when we're working with clients, you have to get, the business might want to analyze by all those different things, right? Like anyone could possibly filter and color by all those things. Yeah. So let's say whether you're using a published or embedded data source, but say you're just using Tableau desktop to make it easy. And then what I say to people all the time then is, if you don't know which of those columns you're going to do, leave them in your data model. This is if you're using an extract. Leave them in your data model. Build all your vizzes, and as your very last step before you run your extract, just take the little down arrow, you make calculations and everything else on, and go hide all unused fields. And it will hide all the fields you're not using. And then what most people don't know is when you run your extract, it doesn't bring all that data into your extract. Right. So it's going to perform way better and no one's using it any. And then people come back and go, well, what if I want to use those in the future? Well, what's slick is Tableau will bring in almost like a ghost field where you can say show hidden fields. You just go to the field you want, you add it. Of course, you can't add it to the viz at that point because the data's not there, but you run the extract again, and then you can add it. So this is the surefire way to make sure that you're not bringing in data from a width perspective that you're not using. So it's again, I don't think Tableau talks about it much. It's just a terribly hidden feature.
It's just like
hidden pun intended.
It's just like this thing that kind of showed up that like, oh, you have to do this, and that's what you have to do.
Yeah. It's super slick.
Well, Kirk, thanks so much for coming on the show. The book is really great. The lessons are fantastic, and something I think more people need to learn and read about. So, so thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, John. Yeah, no, I really enjoyed the time.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode of the show. I hope you enjoyed that interview. I hope you will go check out the blog post we talked about, and also, of course, Kirk's new book, Data Modeling with Tableau, and, of course, his website, Paint with Data. A lot of good content there, a lot of great ways to think about all the things that you need to be better. I would say, obviously, in Tableau, but also just a better person to work with data, just a better data visualizer, a better data scientist, a better statistician. Anyone who works with data really needs to understand this content and these lessons even better. So I hope you enjoyed that episode. I hope you will consider sharing today's episode with your friends and your family. Put it on your social media networks. Share a review or a rating on your favorite podcast provider. And until next week, this has been the PolicyViz podcast. Thanks so much for listening.